If you were to ask someone the single most memorable part of Whiplash, there are a variety of answers they could give that could be considered valid, given the film's masterful execution through and through. But most everyone, be it a layman or a film bro, would choose the final sequence. It is already acknowledged as one of the great film endings of all time, with it serving as a perfect culmination of all the film's built-up tension. But there is something ironic about the final scene being considered a happy ending. Yes, we see our protagonist excel for a brief moment at the thing he was pursuing throughout the film. And this may lead one to believe that this is a sort of a triumph, a bout of success. The director of the film, Damien Chazelle, on the other hand, speaks of how he was surprised that the audience perceived it that way. He says in an interview that I had always thought when writing the film that the ending had veered a little more on tragic than triumphant. In terms of a lot of responses to the movie, at least from what I've seen, the ending seems to be interpreted as a little more triumphant than tragic. Again, that's not something I'm upset about. If anything, it makes the movie more enjoyable for people. But it has been a really interesting thing to observe. I had always intended it to be a pretty dark ending. What does this dissonance between the director's intent and the audience's interpretation say about how we perceive movies? It says that the director's intent, whether explicitly stated or not, can often be trumped by the audience's consensus, or even a vocal minority. In the case of Whiplash, this reading of the ending and the film as a whole reflects a fetishization of the idea of success, by virtue of both the director's intended message and an unintentional reflection of our zeitgeist. A sort of pseudo-Rorschach test has emerged. How you perceive success may determine how you perceive the themes of this film. To be clear, the film inadvertently functions as a reflection of us, not a representation. Whiplash doesn't purposely advocate for any of the behavior it seeks to portray. It doesn't glamorize the vitriol that its characters spew and are defined by. But like many films whose message gets lost in translation, we must now view Whiplash not just from the straightforward perspectives, but from the possible ones as well. In speaking of optics, what is success? As common of a term as it is, we all perceive it very differently. If you were to take the characters of Whiplash and their idea of success, you may end up with something extreme and bordering on destructive. If you were to ask someone with no perceivable ambition, their success may be as simple as getting out of bed and avoiding the eternal despair of their mind. In its most elementary form, success is simply accomplishing a goal, aiming for something and achieving it, no matter the enormity of the task. But the meaning it has taken on cannot be encompassed by this basic definition. What people rarely imagine when you say success is the complete domination of a given domain. To be the absolute best at something and nothing less.
Charlie Parker didn't know anybody until Joe Jonas threw a cymbal at his head.
So that's your idea of success, huh?
I think being the greatest musician of the 20th century is anybody's idea of success.
This can take the form of becoming the best drummer the world has ever seen, to heading a company that beats quarterly profit expectations and constantly innovates, to simply being considered successful, reaping the benefits without having any discernible skill to prove otherwise. This modern iteration of success entices so much as to mobilize the apathetic, embolden the submissive, motivate an entire populace to be in any other situation than the one they're currently in. Much has been made of how to acquire this modern form of success. Like many things once considered intangible, it has been turned into a commodity that can apparently be bought and taught. Some look to self-help books, some force themselves to grind through their corporate jobs in which they have no vested interest, selling their time and soul in hope of receiving some success in return. Some look to motivational speakers and influencers whose advice tends to boil down to work harder. This sage advice is meant to overcome any barrier in your life, including the practical limitations of your socioeconomic status. What can success really mean if everyone is trying to sell it to you? Whiplash provides an interesting template through which we can parse this twisted form of success.
Being broke and drunk and full of at the age of 34 is not exactly my idea of success.
I'd rather die drunk, broke at 34 and have people at a dinner table talk about me than live to be rich and sober at 90 and nobody remember who I was.
In the worst reading of the film, one may take the characters at face value and believe that in order to achieve true greatness, in the case of Andrew Neiman, a drumming virtuoso, you must let go of all things unrelated to your ultimate goal. This includes any relationships, whether familial or romantic. You must think of nothing but drumming. You must dream of nothing else. You must play with such intensity day and night that you develop calluses. Buddy Rich and musicians of the past are your deities, and their music your gospel. Whatever hatred your mentor inflicts onto you, whether it is berating you or mentally and physically abusing you, it is simply a means to an end, and to bring out the best version of yourself. Anyone else that doesn't understand is a pushover with no ambition, that can't handle the pressure. While this isn't the interpretation that most would necessarily take away from the film, it is an interpretation through the lens of contemporary hustle culture, particularly the element of this culture concerned with the idolizing of the grind. To work tirelessly at a singular task and romanticize the journey as an accomplishment. This isn't necessarily problematic, as it can help people to achieve goals that would otherwise feel out of reach. Many goals require you to embrace the journey in order to maintain a level of consistency, so it can help to embrace the tediousness of a task in order to reap the reward in the end. But when it gets to the point where your approach becomes all or nothing, when your entire existence is defined solely through your work, when you view those that aren't able to achieve similar success as you as lesser and not as ambitious, when you are finally successful, but as a result, condescending, we begin to get to a problematic place. To see the grind worship exemplified in modern life, look no further than the entire subculture concerned with the archetype of the tortured genius. The savant that stands above their peers and inspires or coerces those around them to rise above. The layperson that starts at the bottom and continuously grinds until they reach the top. Or the artist whose work is only truly appreciated once they pass away. These are those that are so deeply intertwined with their work that their work is all they really are, to most people on the outside at least. In the worst cases, they often devolve into madness, delusion, or even death. Often, but not always, the adoration may be misplaced and the virtue manufactured. Despite all of this, the prospect of fame and glory is so enticing that if someone is not considered a tortured genius, they're trying their hardest to become one. We want to be considered the person that is a master at their craft. We prefer to be viewed as busy and all-consumed to those on the outside, as if to signal that we have true purpose and understanding. We are obsessed with those that are best at what they do, and much of who and what we idolize is informed by that. As outlandish as those aspirations may sound, the beauty of Whiplash is that to some extent and for a period of time, the film manipulates us into positively identifying with these seemingly delusional ideas. The unironic interpretation of the film concerned with the grind and the pursuit of the tortured genius status. These are ideas that we are fed through the protagonist in Andrew Neiman, and as a result are softened towards. As we follow his growth from a little fish in a big pond to the core drummer in the studio band, we feel his budding ambition. We pity his struggle with his own inadequacy. And of course, we revel in his accomplishments. As we walk alongside Andrew, our empathy towards his struggle grows, and we desire nothing but for him to accomplish his goals. We empathize with the idea of pursuing something you're deeply passionate about and feeling as if every force is actively working against you. We understand the feeling of believing so strongly of your own potential that you pour your entire soul into the pursuit. Being passionate and working hard have always been admirable traits. But as more of the plot reveals itself, the true driver behind this perspective becomes apparent. Fear. It's the fear of inadequacy, fear of not living up to the expectations of the master, fear of being just normal. Our newfound understanding of how toxic this relationship has become is meant to shift our sympathies. This is how storytelling should function. How we feel about an idea, about a character, all of that is subject to change as more information reveals itself to us. Outside of the meta-narrative, nothing is set in stone in the film until at least the roll of the credits. While Chazelle does set out to depict his admiration of the grind and the pursuit of excellence, the film is much more concerned with what the consequences are. He draws from his own experience as a jazz drummer, where he sees the merit of using fear as a motivator to push yourself past your limits. He says, "I was so motivated by that fear. Getting this guy's approval meant more to me than anything. It motivated me to be a good drummer, so it worked for me, but it also posed the question of what would happen if you were to push that kind of behavior even further. What would you do if you had a teacher who was a true objective monster, not just someone who scares you personally or is tough on you and maybe borderline cruel? At what point do the ends not justify the means?" There are many points in the film where we see why this obsessive mindset can be dangerous. and what Chazelle is attempting to portray becomes clearer and clearer. The whole film builds on the hypothetical of, what if it doesn't work out? What if all of your hard work goes to waste because of one bad day? I believe most everyone understands and internalizes this idea while watching the film. The only things that can change their minds is the ignorance that comes with time, or the inflection point that is the ending. Some people may look at the ending as an affirmation of this mindset and turn a blind eye to the consequences. So why is it that films that are an indictment of a topic end up as objects of glorification? Why do we worship the things we're supposed to despise? Why is this perversion of success a possible takeaway from Whiplash? It's because sometimes movies make things seem like a lot of fun. Even if a director is making a film about the inevitable harm something can cause, if there is any portion of the film depicting the characters enjoying themselves with something harmful, then it is fair game to assume that things will be taken out of context. It's why people love all the scenes in the first half of Goodfellas, but don't tend to recall as fondly the drug-fueled downward spiral that follows it. Modern media and its fragmented, abbreviated nature in the form of short videos help to solidify this idea. Often we don't rewatch films beginning to end, we watch individual scenes on YouTube or see fan edits on TikTok. The public consciousness of a film or form of media is more likely to be remembered through its pieces, not its entirety. Our memories are malleable, and we're susceptible to picking and choosing the interpretations that quell our cognitive dissonance. It's why Patrick Bateman has somehow unironically become a Sigma male icon. Because if you view American Psycho from a point of massive abstraction, the superficial glamour of the lifestyle portrayed becomes desirable. It's why Tyler Durden's speeches from Fight Club being posted out of context caused the film's message to become a call to rise up against some imaginary other. As time goes on, we become more susceptible to changing our view of a film, so being presented the same thing in a different package can be a crude yet effective method of changing our mind. Just as we extol the virtues of days past but forget the suffering it entailed, we can sometimes be optimistic to a fault. So is it realistic to think that fan edits of Andrew struggling and Fletcher pushing him towards greatness could become what people think Whiplash is really about? Anecdotally, I would say that this has already started, and I would wager that this sentiment will grow in tandem with the burgeoning economy of faux success. A large part of cinematic history involves misinterpretation and misplaced glorification, either immediately after the film's release or through retrospective analysis. Please keep in mind that this is a world in which The Wolf of Wall Street, a film which portrays a real-life enterprise that scammed innocent middle to lower class people out of their hard-earned money, is seen as motivational. This is a world in which the message many got from Fight Club is that anarchy is good. Whether the film inadvertently functions as a reflection of us or this opinion is more of a preemptive strike, the point remains. Even if most people got the right idea, never underestimate the potential for an audience to miss the point. Speaking of missing the point, let's analyze the primary character trait that underlies the film's antagonistic figure. We speak, of course, of Terrence Fletcher, but more specifically of what he personifies: tough love. He represents the instructor that doesn't enforce good habits with praise, rather deters bad habits with hostility. The mentor that doesn't ever say good job. There is much discourse about the apparent snowflake generation or the recent generation of kids who have been coddled into a spoiled lifestyle. Some yearn for the return of harsh times when we didn't pamper our youth, when we could use physical force to discipline without being questioned, and when misery was seen as progress. While elements of a doctrine to embrace hardship can ring true, to think that punishment should be the sole driver of success is ludicrous. The film makes it clear: Fletcher is a bad person. His methods are vile. Despite his quasi-redemption at the film's conclusion, he's given all the cinematic treatment of a villain. Just in case the abhorrent insults and abuse he exhibits aren't enough to make this clear, he's framed and shot in such a way that there's no ambiguity in what the filmmaker thinks of him. Chazelle says of Fletcher, his cruelty comes from a genuine love for music, but he's also an utter monster. I wanted to make sure that this was a character where there were shades of gray in terms of his philosophy, and in how much you might buy it, but in terms of the actual behavior he exhibits on screen, there's no gray zone. While him being evil is not a central message of the film, the characterization is clear enough. Despite this, he is somehow seen as someone who is just pushing his students towards success. Fletcher has one thing in common with those that admire him. They both think he's the hero. His methods are rooted in manipulation and pitting people against each other. He essentially uses each of the drummers as bait for each other, breeding an environment rooted in toxicity. He constantly mentions the story of Charlie Parker having a cymbal thrown at his head when he messed up, and then goes on to enact his own version of it. His conflation of abuse with motivation is exactly what his admirers would take away from his anecdotes and lessons. Like Chazelle says, in theory, his ideas may come off as sound, but the film exemplifies why his methods are not ideal on multiple occasions. The fate of his former student, Sean Casey, is a prime example. Fletcher tells the class of Casey's struggles and how he guided him to success. He mentions his rise to playing first trumpet at the Lincoln Center. He then speaks in a seemingly regretful manner when he announces to the class that he has died in a car accident. But we later learn that he took his own life, and much implication is made that Fletcher's abuse instilled in him a level of anxiety that caused him to get to that point. Fletcher lies about the reality of the situation because he knows exactly what it looks like. If we give any significance to Occam's razor, it is likely that his students would think the same thing. Fletcher is partially at fault. And to make the situation more tragic than it is, Fletcher has this to say to Andrew in the jazz club.
The truth is, Andrew, I never really had a Charlie Parker.
So does this mean that Sean Casey didn't accomplish success, despite achieving great heights and prestige in jazz music? Why couldn't he become Fletcher's Charlie Parker? In a completely twisted way, it's possible that Sean failed to meet Fletcher's criteria for greatness. It is possible that Fletcher accepts the idea deep in his subconscious that Sean couldn't drown out the noise. He became deterred by words. He failed to become one of the greats, which in Fletcher's eyes is a failure, as terrible as that may sound. If all of this isn't enough of an indictment, then perhaps the most clearly spelled out example of the dangers of the Fletcher method is Andrew Neiman. Before the final performance, as a result of burning out from Fletcher's mentorship, he now works as a cashier, a profession he once saw as ambitionless. He is no longer associated with the prestigious institution of Schaefer, a school he once saw as holier than any of the other schools around him.
So Fordham was just like a random school?
No, I applied to a bunch of schools and Fordham let me in. Why'd you pick Schaefer?
It's the best music school in the country.
And he has ended a relationship to pursue the career he is no longer able to. The bombastic finale may delude some into believing in a happy ending, as Andrew achieves the performance of his life. He perhaps resuscitates his music career that was all but gone, and the mentor whose approval he so dearly cherished comes around and finally gives him the nod of approval. But all things considered, where does Andrew stand now? Was the one amazing performance worth him losing everything, including a potential career in his desired field? Becoming a shell of himself that is riddled with anxiety and self-hatred? Alienating family members? Burning a relationship bridge that he was clearly receiving the better end of emotionally? Was it worth it? Chazelle says of the ending that, "I don't think Andrew physically dies, but I think a big part of his soul has definitely died." Andrew gives it his all in the end, and while he doesn't physically die after his performance, he loses much of what he worked toward and what was to come after. There is also the likelihood that the performance is not enough to overcome his misgivings and will not result in any further opportunities. But let's say for the sake of argument that the final performance does result in some opportunity. Let's ignore him assaulting a faculty member at a university and getting expelled in the process. Let's forget his public humiliation at the hands of Fletcher. Let's say that he has set himself up for success in music. But what has he been reduced to? He may have deluded himself into thinking he's in control of his destiny, but seeking Fletcher's approval in the end signals his all-superseding need to be accepted. Perhaps he is now back on track to pursue this twisted form of success in the mold of his music career. But the tragedy isn't if you view success in its basic form, simply accomplishing a goal. Andrew Neiman's goal has become Fletcher's approval. He has sold his soul to the devil in pursuit of what he sees as excellence. And to say nothing of the other casualties in the process of Fletcher's pursuit of a great pupil would be to ignore reality. All the distress, destruction, and even death he has caused. that of which we know and that of which is left as ambiguous. The film makes clear its stance that there are consequences to this obsession we mistake for success. But how do we really feel about it? Is the pursuit of this perversion of success warranted? At what point is the art worth the artist? When artists become one with their work and lose themselves in the process, we mourn the loss. We cherish their work and reflect on what it means to us. But deep down, somewhere buried deep in the recesses of our minds, we reconcile the idea that the demons that took the artist away from us are what enabled the genius of their art in the first place. We tend to repeat the examples that are convenient to recount, like Michael Jordan's tyrannical approach with his teammates on the Chicago Bulls, or the titans of industry of modern day that we can't seem to make up our minds on. But what of those we lost in the process? Do we mourn the loss of Kurt Cobain to his demons in spite of them fueling his songwriting and musical genius? Are we okay with Steve Jobs' hyper-controlling and stubborn nature that resulted in perhaps the greatest innovations of modern times, when it also means that he didn't seek out traditional and readily available medical care for his ailments? Are we okay with everything that comes with being a tortured genius, or just the parts that are easier to digest for us? Here's the strange thing. In a peculiar way, for the select few from the already small crop of those that fully subscribe to this doctrine of success, to them, it is worth it. All the pain and suffering, all the negativity you develop in the process, no matter the cautionary tales in reality or the reflections portrayed in fiction, those concerned with the egotistical will always find a way to justify dominion. By this modern definition of success, our characters have failed to become the masters of their domain. Even though they understood the assignment, they are no longer in pursuit of being the best at what they do. The aftermath of Andrew getting kicked out of school and bringing Fletcher down with him means that neither has achieved the modern form of success. Fletcher is playing at a jazz club on weekdays and opening for acts too great for him to compose. And Andrew, of course, is barely holding on in the world of music at all. Even by the basic definition of success, as in simply accomplishing a goal, neither would say that they have good standing by that criteria either. However, by the time the credits roll, Fletcher nods in approval of Andrew, as if to say that he has finally found his next prospective Charlie Parker. The story Fletcher repeated endlessly was of how Charlie Parker was embarrassed one year and channeled the vitriol into greatness the next time he stepped on stage. The student he had always been searching for was the one that wouldn't be deterred by his insults and games. It wasn't just to be a masterful musician, it was to be ambitious, to be undeterred. Fletcher used these qualities, among others, as a litmus test to see if he had found that student. And he found his Charlie Parker in Andrew Neiman. Fletcher was successful, by the traditional definition. The tragedy is that Andrew Neiman perceived Fletcher's acceptance as a goal for himself. By that unfortunate measure, and by the measure of simply accomplishing a goal, Andrew Neiman is successful, just not in the way he might have hoped for.